I supported my wife through her addiction recovery, only for her to later say she needed to find herself while getting involved with her therapist. In response, I ruined their lives, and now they're pleading with me. My name is Kevin. I am 38, and I work as a structural engineer in Austin. I manage mid-sized commercial renovation projects, which means steady hours, decent pay, and a schedule built around deadlines rather than chaos. I am not flashy, but I am consistent. I bought a 2-bedroom house in South Austin 6 years ago, and I have lived there ever since. My wife is Lena. She is 35. We have been married for 7 years and together for 10. We do not have children. Until recently, we shared the mortgage, the utilities, and a fairly predictable routine. 3 years into our marriage, Lena developed a dependency on prescription pain medication after a minor surgery. What started as something legitimate shifted slowly into something that controlled her mood and schedule. I was the one who noticed first. I was also the one who insisted we address it. I paid for private treatment when insurance started limiting coverage. I rearranged my project assignments so I could drive her to outpatient therapy 3 times a week across town. I sat through family sessions where she described me as rigid and emotionally unavailable, which I accepted because I understood she needed somewhere to put her anger. Recovery was not clean or quick. There were relapses. There were missing pills. There were nights where she was sharp and cruel for no reason other than withdrawal. I did not threaten to leave. I did not scream. I documented finances, locked up medications in the house, and set clear conditions. If she skipped therapy, I would inform her parents. If she lied about prescriptions, I would move out temporarily. I followed through once, for 2 weeks, and she corrected course. That is how we operated. Direct action, clear consequences. By last year, she was stable. She had been sober for 14 months. She credited her therapist heavily, a man in his early 40s named Merrick who specialized in addiction recovery. I never met him outside of one joint session. He presented as calm and measured. I had no reason to doubt his professionalism. The shift did not start dramatically. It began with Lena telling me she felt confined, not by sobriety, but by me. She said she had spent so many years defined by addiction that she no longer knew who she was. At first, I assumed this was a normal phase after recovery. What I did not expect was how quickly that narrative would start to include someone else. At first, it was subtle language changes. Lena stopped saying we when she talked about the future. It became I need and I want. She started staying longer at her weekly sessions. What had been an hour became 90 minutes, sometimes 2. When I asked, she said recovery is not a stopwatch. She accused me of treating therapy like a billable project. I accepted that explanation for a while because it sounded reasonable. I work in an environment where time is measured, tracked, optimized. I assumed I was projecting that mindset onto something that should be fluid. Still, I pay attention to patterns for a living. Structural integrity depends on noticing small shifts before they become failures. She became sharper at home, not chaotic like during withdrawal, but deliberately dismissive. If I asked how her session went, she would say Merrick understands things you never did. If I suggested we take a weekend trip like we used to, she would say she was focusing on growth, not distractions. The first time his name entered an argument directly was on a Thursday night. I had asked her to confirm whether she would attend my firm's annual dinner. It is not glamorous, but spouses are invited. She rolled her eyes and said Merrick thinks I am too dependent on your professional image. He says I have spent years orbiting your stability instead of building my own. That phrasing stuck with me. Orbiting your stability. It sounded rehearsed. Clinical. I asked her if she felt that way or if that was something he suggested. She snapped that I was jealous of the only person who ever helped her without conditions. That comment was inaccurate. My support always came with conditions because addiction without boundaries becomes chaos. She knew that, but she reframed it as control. Over the next month, that narrative hardened. I was the rigid engineer. He was the empathetic guide. I was structure. He was freedom. Then she told me she needed space. Not a separation, just emotional distance to find herself. She said that phrase calmly, like she had practiced it. I asked what that meant in practical terms. She could not define it clearly, which is when my concern shifted from insecurity to suspicion. I did not accuse her of anything. I started gathering information instead. When I say I gathered information, I do not mean I hacked her accounts or installed anything on her phone. I mean I paid attention to observable facts. Lena had always left her phone face up on the kitchen counter. Suddenly, it was always screen down. She started taking calls on the back patio instead of in the living room. When I walked out once to ask about dinner, she covered the speaker with her hand and said she would be inside in a minute. It was not a friend. I could hear the low tone of a man's voice. I checked our shared credit card statements. Nothing dramatic. No hotel charges. No large unexplained purchases. But I did notice that her therapy payments had shifted from weekly to twice weekly. She had not told me that. When I asked, she said recovery is non-linear and accused me of auditing her healing. I asked directly if she was seeing Merrick outside of scheduled sessions. She laughed in a way that was not amused. She said that is exactly the kind of paranoid control that proves I am not emotionally safe. That phrase again sounded rehearsed. Emotionally safe. I requested one concrete boundary. If she needed space to find herself, fine. But therapy should remain therapy. No contact outside scheduled appointments. No private messaging unrelated to treatment. That is standard ethical practice. I was calm when I said it. She stared at me and said, "You do not get to dictate how I heal." She also said something that changed the temperature of the room. She said, "You would not understand the connection we have because you only operate in transactions." Connection, not guidance, not support. Connection. That was the moment I stopped assuming this was just post-recovery identity confusion. I asked her a very simple question. Are you romantically involved with your therapist? She did not answer immediately. She asked why I always jumped to worst-case scenarios. I repeated the question. She said, "I do not know what I feel yet." For me, that was an answer. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten. I asked one more direct question. Are you in personal contact with him outside scheduled sessions? She said, "We talk when I need clarity." That phrasing told me everything. The house is in my name. I bought it before we got married. The mortgage, deed, and insurance are solely mine. She contributes to utilities and shared expenses, but legally it is my property. I have always been deliberate about paperwork. Not because I expected this, but because that is how I operate. I told her clearly that she would not continue living in my house while cultivating a personal connection with her therapist. There was no option presented. I was not asking her to choose between us in that moment. I was ending cohabitation effective immediately. She tried to minimize it. She said nothing physical had happened. She said I was overreacting to an emotional support dynamic. I told her that a licensed addiction therapist engaging in personal communication with a married client is not a support dynamic. It is a breach. And I will not share a bed with someone who is emotionally investing elsewhere while framing it as self-discovery. She called me cold. She said this proved she was right about me. I stayed practical. I told her to pack essential clothing, toiletries, and any personal documents she needed. I transferred half of our joint savings into her individual account while she stood there so she could not claim financial coercion later. I documented the transfer on my laptop. She asked where she was supposed to go. I told her that was no longer my responsibility. If Merrick was providing clarity and connection, she could lean on that. She said that was unfair. I said what is unfair is expecting me to fund a situation that disrespects me. I gave her 40 minutes. I remained in the living room while she moved through the bedroom, pulling clothes into a suitcase. There was no screaming, just tension. When she finished, I carried the suitcase to the front door and set it on the porch. I told her that once she stepped out, I would be changing the locks the following morning. Not out of spite, but because ambiguity creates mess. She stood there waiting for me to reconsider. I did not. She did not cry. That is something people usually ask when I tell this story. No tears, no dramatic pleas. She shifted tactics instead. She said I was abandoning her during a vulnerable phase. She said after everything she survived with addiction, I was proving that my support had always been conditional. I agreed that it was conditional. I told her that sobriety required structure, and so did marriage. I am not interested in open-ended emotional triangles disguised as therapy. She stood in the doorway holding her phone like it was a lifeline. I asked one last practical question. Are you planning to continue seeing him as your therapist while communicating personally? She said she needed him, not his program. Him. I opened the front door. I did not touch her. I did not drag anything. I simply stepped aside and told her it was time to leave. She tried one more angle. She said if I forced her out, she would tell people I was emotionally abusive. I told her she was free to say whatever she wanted. The deed and the bank transfers would speak for themselves. That is when she finally walked out. I closed the door and locked it. I did not feel rage. I felt clarity. The next morning I called a locksmith and had the exterior locks replaced. I also updated the garage code. I kept the receipt. Again, documentation. By midday she was texting nonstop. First it was anger. Then it was disbelief. Then it was bargaining. She said we could create new boundaries together. She said Merrick had encouraged healthy separation, not eviction. That detail caught my attention. Encouraged separation. That meant he knew. I responded once. If he is advising you on our marriage outside clinical parameters, I will be contacting the licensing board. Her reply came within seconds. You would not dare. She still did not understand that I operate on process, not emotion. I did dare. Before doing anything formal, I verified my assumptions. I drafted a short email to Merrick from my personal account. I kept it factual. I stated that my wife had informed me they were communicating outside scheduled sessions and that he had advised her regarding separation from our shared home. I asked him to clarify whether their contact extended beyond professional boundaries and whether he was still acting as her licensed therapist. I did not threaten in that message. I requested documentation. He replied the next morning. The tone was controlled but defensive. He said he could not discuss a client without written consent. That is standard and fair. What was not standard was the second paragraph. He wrote that therapeutic relationships can evolve and that growth sometimes disrupts existing partnerships. Therapeutic relationships can evolve. That is not neutral language. I forwarded that email to Lena and asked if she had provided written consent for him to discuss her treatment philosophy with me. She did not respond directly. Instead, she sent a long message about how I was attacking the only person who truly supported her autonomy. Autonomy had become her new keyword. At that point, I shifted from personal to procedural. I pulled the state licensing guidelines for mental health professionals in Texas. They are public. Dual relationships with current clients are explicitly prohibited. Romantic involvement is grounds for investigation, even if initiated by the client. I did not need proof of physical involvement. I needed evidence of boundary erosion. I compiled a timeline, dates of extended sessions, screenshots of her messages referencing his personal advice, the email where he framed disruption of marriage as therapeutic evolution. I saved everything in a dated folder. Then I filed a formal complaint. Not out of spite, out of principle. If a therapist inserts himself into a vulnerable client's marriage and begins framing himself as the path to self-discovery, that is not romance. That is exploitation. Within 48 hours, both of them understood I was serious. And that is when the pleading started. Lena called first. Not text. Not a long message. An actual call. I let it ring once before answering because I wanted to be certain I was calm. Her tone was different. No edge. No superiority. She said filing a complaint could destroy his career. I said if his career depends on private emotional entanglement with married clients, then it deserves scrutiny. She said I was twisting something innocent into something unethical. I asked her directly if they had discussed a future together. Silence. Then she said that was not the point. For me, that was confirmation. 2 hours later, Merrick emailed again. This time the language was cautious. He stated that any perception of impropriety was a misunderstanding and that he valued professional ethics. He asked if we could resolve this privately to avoid unnecessary escalation. Unnecessary. I responded that the board would determine necessity, not me. I also informed him that I had preserved all written communication. That ended his tone of quiet authority. What I did not anticipate was how quickly Lena's certainty collapsed. She showed up at the house 3 days later while I was home. I had already changed the locks. She rang the bell repeatedly until I opened the door, but remained inside. She looked smaller. Not physically, just uncertain. She said he had reduced her sessions abruptly. She said he told her continued contact could jeopardize his license while an investigation was pending. So the man who encouraged her autonomy now needed distance. She asked if I would withdraw the complaint. She said this had gone too far. I told her it went too far when her therapist began positioning himself as a replacement partner under the language of healing. She said she never meant for it to explode like this. I told her actions have consequences whether intended or not. For the first time, she said she might have misread the connection. That was the beginning of the unraveling. After that visit, the tone shifted completely. The arrogance was gone. What replaced it was fear. Not fear of losing me. Fear of exposure. Lena began sending long messages trying to reframe everything. She said Merrick never explicitly crossed a physical line. She said therapy creates emotional intensity, and I was misinterpreting professional language. She said I was retaliating because I could not tolerate her independence. I did not debate. I requested one practical thing: full access to all communication with him outside scheduled sessions. If this was truly innocent, Transparency would protect everyone. She delayed. She said I was interrogating her. She said trust cannot survive surveillance. That was ironic, considering the situation. I repeated the request once. She refused again. That was enough for me. I sent a final message. I will not continue this discussion. The complaint stands. Do not come to the house again without prior notice. Then I blocked her number. Not out of anger. Out of containment. Continuous back and forth only creates emotional leverage points. I removed that option. I also blocked her on social media and adjusted privacy settings. If she needed to coordinate retrieval of remaining belongings, she could do so through email or through an attorney. Structured channels only. 2 days later, Merrick emailed again. This time the language had shifted from confident to urgent. He wrote that misunderstandings can spiral and that professional reputations take decades to build. He suggested mediation. He implied that Lena's recovery could be destabilized by unnecessary stress. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded his email to the investigator assigned to the complaint and added it to the documentation file. Attempts to influence the complainant during review are not a good look. By the end of the week, both of them understood that access to me was closed. No emotional negotiations. No reactive conversations. Just process. For the first time since this started, I felt fully in control of the situation. Blocking Lena did not stop the consequences from unfolding. It just removed the emotional noise. About 3 weeks after filing the complaint, I received formal confirmation that an investigation had been opened. They requested copies of all communications I had referenced. I provided them in an organized folder with dates and short summaries. No commentary, just facts. A few days later, Lena showed up again. This time she did not ring the bell repeatedly. She knocked once and waited. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. She looked exhausted. Not dramatic, just worn down. She told me Merrick had terminated her as a client effective immediately. He cited conflict of interest concerns and the pending review. She said he recommended she transfer to another provider in a different practice. So the man who positioned himself as uniquely attuned to her growth had stepped back the moment scrutiny appeared. She said he stopped answering personal messages. She said he told her any further contact could be misinterpreted. That word again. Misinterpreted. Then she asked the question I expected eventually. If I withdraw the complaint, will you let me come home? I answered carefully. The complaint is not leverage. It is a response to behavior. Even if I withdrew it, the underlying issue remains. You chose to emotionally invest in your therapist and frame me as an obstacle to your evolution. She said she was confused. She said recovery changes people. I agreed. It does. But confusion does not require secrecy or triangulation. She tried one final angle. She said she still loved me and that this was a mistake amplified by pride. That may even be true, but intent does not erase impact. I told her I would proceed with filing for divorce. Not out of revenge. Out of finality. For the first time since I met her, she had nothing sharp to say back. I filed for divorce the following Monday. Texas has a waiting period, which I was already aware of, so there was no dramatic courthouse sprint. I retained the same attorney who advised me during the complaint process. Clean paperwork. Clear asset separation. The house remains mine. The joint savings had already been divided. There were no children to complicate custody. From a legal standpoint, it was straightforward. Emotionally, it was not chaotic either. That is what surprises people. There was no screaming match at the end. No last-minute reconciliation attempt. Once I made the decision, I did not revisit it. About a month into the investigation, I received notice that the board had issued an interim restriction on Marek's practice pending full review. I was not given details beyond procedural language, but it was enough to confirm that the complaint was taken seriously. Lena emailed me once after being served divorce papers. A long message about regret and how quickly everything unraveled. She said she never expected him to distance himself the way he did. She said she felt discarded by both of us. I responded with one paragraph. I did not discard you. I enforced a boundary when you chose to redirect your emotional loyalty. That is not abandonment. That is consequence. I did not block her email. I simply stopped engaging beyond logistical matters related to the divorce. No late-night reflections. No postmortems. People sometimes ask if I ruined their lives. I did not fabricate anything. I did not exaggerate. I documented, reported, and removed myself from a situation that disrespected me. If a licensed therapist decides to blur lines with a married client and frame himself as her path to self-discovery, that is his decision. If my wife chooses to participate in that dynamic while living under my roof, that is hers. My decision was simpler. I refused to subsidize it. Now the house is quiet again. The schedule is predictable. The locks are mine. And I do not regret acting when I did. Hello. I told my fiancée she was getting too close to her male best friend. She replied, "You're just insecure. He was in my life before you. If you make me choose, I'll choose him every time." So I made my decision. I called off the wedding and cut them both out. For months later, she showed up again, pregnant and in tears. My name is Brad, I am 31, and I work as a residential home inspector in Charleston. My days are structured around appointments, crawling through attics, checking foundations, and writing detailed reports that people rely on before making expensive decisions. It is steady work, early starts, and I tend to keep a predictable routine outside of that. I'm not big on going out, and I always thought that made me easy to build a life with. My fiancée is Julia, 29. We had been together a little over 3 years when this started becoming impossible to ignore. We were not married yet, but the venue was booked, deposits were paid, and we had already been living together for just under a year in the townhouse I was renting before she moved in. I am posting because I want outside opinions, but I also need to lay this out clearly because every time I tried to bring it up, the conversation got flipped back on me. According to Julia, I was not noticing anything real. I was being insecure. According to me, the pattern was the problem. The issue was her best friend, Owen. He is 33, single, and the kind of guy who always manages to be present without doing anything obvious enough to call out in one clean sentence. He was not some distant friend she saw once in a while. He was built into her weekly routine. Coffee before work some mornings. Gym check-ins. Late phone calls. Random errands together that somehow stretched into half the day. If she had a stressful day, he knew before I did. If something good happened, he usually heard it first. At first I tried to be reasonable. I met him, stayed polite, included him when it made sense. I am not someone who thinks men and women cannot be friends. But there is a difference between friendship and priority, and after a while it felt like I was adjacent to my own relationship instead of actually in it. What bothered me most was not obvious flirting. It was ranking. He came first in ways she acted like I was too petty to notice. She canceled on me twice in 1 month because of him, once because he had a rough day and once because he did not want to go alone to an event. Meanwhile, if I asked for one evening where her phone was not lighting up from him every few minutes, I got told I was making things weird. Then there was a dinner at her friend Tessa's place. The night I stopped questioning myself and started paying attention to details I probably should have caught earlier. The strange part is that Owen was the one who gave me the first real clue, and I do not think he even realized it. Tessa's place is one of those renovated older homes near downtown, the kind where everything looks casual but is actually planned down to the smallest detail. There were about 10 people there, mostly her friends, a couple of partners, and Owen showed up about 20 minutes after we did. Julia lit up when he walked in. Not in a dramatic way, just a shift that was noticeable if you were paying attention. I stayed consistent. I greeted him, shook his hand, asked him how he had been. He gave me the same relaxed energy he always does, like we were on neutral terms. Nothing openly disrespectful. That is part of what made it hard to explain later. There was never one obvious moment you could point to and say that crossed a line. We all settled into the evening, food, drinks, people rotating between the kitchen and the living room. Julia drifted toward Owen pretty quickly. Again, nothing dramatic. Just proximity. They stood close, leaned in to talk, shared things on their phones. I made a point not to hover. I talked to other people, stayed engaged, but I kept track of time. About an hour in, I realized I had barely spoken to her since we arrived. Every time I looked over, she was mid-conversation with him. Not a group conversation either. It was always just the two of them, angled slightly away from everyone else. At one point I walked over to refill my drink and ended up next to them. I caught the tail end of something Owen said. He mentioned a place they used to go to all the time, and then said something about how it had not been the same since she moved in with me. He said it casually, like it was an established fact. Julia laughed and nudged him, but she did not correct it. She did not include me. She did not even acknowledge that I was standing right there. It was a small moment, but it stuck. The way he framed it made it sound like I had disrupted something ongoing between them, not like I was her partner. I asked what they were talking about, keeping my tone neutral. Julia gave a short summary that skipped over most of the context, like I was catching up on a conversation I was not really part of. Owen filled in a detail, but again, it was phrased in a way that assumed history I was not included in. I stepped away after that, not to make a scene, just to reset and watch more carefully. Patterns matter more than isolated comments. Over the next 40 minutes, I noticed the same thing repeat. Inside jokes, shared references, a kind of familiarity that went beyond normal friendship. The part that shifted things for me was when Tessa made a comment across the room asking if Julia was still splitting her weekends the same way. It sounded like a joke, but it landed differently once I processed it. Julia brushed it off quickly, almost too quickly, and changed the subject. I did not react in the moment. I stayed through the rest of the dinner, kept things calm, drove us home like nothing was wrong. But by the time we pulled into the driveway, I had already made up my mind that I was not going to let this sit as a vague feeling anymore. I was going to ask direct questions and get direct answers that same night. Once we got back to the townhouse, I did not drag it out. It was already late, and I prefer dealing with things while the details are still fresh instead of letting them turn into something vague by morning. Julia kicked off her shoes, went straight to the kitchen, and started scrolling through her phone like the night had been completely normal. I gave it a minute, then I asked her if we could talk. She sighed before I even finished the sentence, which already told me how the conversation was going to go. I kept it simple. I told her I had been noticing a pattern for a while, and tonight just made it clearer. I said she was getting too close to Owen in ways that did not feel appropriate for someone who was about to get married. She did not even hesitate. She leaned back against the counter, crossed her arms, and gave me this look like I had just confirmed something negative about myself. She said I was being insecure, not in a defensive tone, just flat, like it was an objective fact she was pointing out. Then she added that Owen had been in her life before me, and that I needed to respect that instead of trying to compete with it. I told her I was not trying to compete with anyone. I was pointing out specific behaviors. The time they spent together, the way she prioritized him, the way I was being sidelined in my own relationship. I gave examples from that night and from the past few weeks. She brushed all of it off. Every example turned into me misinterpreting something. Every concern became me overthinking. She did not engage with the substance at all. She stayed focused on the idea that the problem was how I was perceiving things, not what was actually happening. That is when I made it direct. I told her I was not comfortable continuing toward marriage with things staying like this. I said if there were no boundaries, then there was a real problem. I asked her plainly where I stood compared to him. She did not soften. If anything, she seemed irritated that I was pushing it to a clear answer. She said if I was going to frame it like a choice, then I needed to be ready for the answer. Then she said it. Calm, almost bored. She said if I made her choose, she would choose him every time. There was no hesitation, no attempt to walk it back, no awareness of how final that sounded. Just a statement, like she was clarifying something obvious. I did not argue after that. There was nothing left to debate. The situation was clear in a way it had not been before. I nodded, said okay, and went upstairs. Not to cool off, not to think it over again. I already had the information I needed. The only thing left was deciding what I was going to do with it, and I made that decision faster than she expected. I did not sleep on it. That matters, because I know how people tend to frame decisions like this afterward. They call it impulsive or emotional. This was neither. She gave me a clear answer to a direct question, and I treated it as reliable information. I went upstairs and started gathering all her things. Not just a small bag. I mean systematically going through drawers, the closet, the bathroom, separating what was hers from what was mine. I kept it organized, folding clothes, putting everything into boxes and bags so there would be no reason for her to come back later and drag things out. She came upstairs about 10 minutes later and stopped in the doorway when she saw what I was doing. She asked what I thought I was doing, but her tone was more annoyed than confused, like I was creating unnecessary drama. I told her directly that if she was choosing him every time, then there was no reason for her to stay here as my fiancé. I said I was not going to compete for that position, and I was not going to move forward with a wedding under those conditions. She immediately pushed back. She said I was overreacting, that I was taking one sentence and blowing up the entire relationship. I kept it simple and reminded her it was not one sentence. It was a pattern, and that sentence just confirmed where I stood in it. She tried to reframe it as me giving her an ultimatum. I corrected that. I told her I already asked the question and she already answered it. This was just me acting on that answer. I kept packing while we talked. No raised voices, no pacing, just steady movement. It made the situation feel more real than any argument would have. At one point, she told me to stop, like she expected me to pause and reconsider. I did not. I finished boxing up what was hers in the bedroom, then moved through the rest of the townhouse. Kitchen items she brought, personal things in the living room, everything separated cleanly. When I was done, I brought everything downstairs and set it near the door. I told her she could call someone to pick her up or arrange a ride herself, but she was not staying there that night. The lease and utilities were all in my name, and there was no practical reason to delay it. She stood there for a moment, like she was waiting for me to walk it back. When I did not, she grabbed her phone and started texting someone, already irritated. I did not ask who. At that point, it did not matter. By the next morning, I had already started canceling the wedding. Within 48 hours, everything was shut down, and both her and Owen were blocked. It was abrupt, but it was clean, and at the time I assumed that was the end of it. The first week after that was quieter than I expected. No messages, no attempts to reach out from unknown numbers, nothing through mutual friends. Given how confident Julia had been in that conversation, I assumed she had shifted straight into relying on Owen, and that was that. From a practical standpoint, things were simple. She had taken everything that was clearly hers. A few small items were left behind, mostly things that had blended into the apartment over time, but nothing important enough to justify reopening contact. I boxed those up and put them in a closet. I also changed a few things immediately. Passwords, access to shared subscriptions, anything that had overlap. Not out of paranoia, just standard cleanup. When you remove someone from your life that quickly, you close every loose end at the same time. Work stayed steady, which helped. My job is detail-oriented, and it does not really allow for distraction. If I miss something during an inspection, it has consequences for someone else. That kept my focus where it needed to be during the day, and by the time I got home, I was too tired to replay conversations. There were a couple of moments where the absence was noticeable, but not in the way people usually describe. It was more logistical than emotional. Fewer groceries needed. Less noise. No background calls happening in the evening. The space felt more controlled. About 2 weeks in, I ran into Tessa at a coffee place near one of my inspection sites. It was not planned. She recognized me. We exchanged basic conversation, and then she asked, carefully, what had happened. I gave her a short version. Not the entire breakdown, just the key point. I told her Julia made it clear where I stood compared to Owen, and I acted accordingly. Tessa did not seem surprised. That stood out to me. She did not defend Julia. She did not try to reframe it. She just nodded and said that things between Julia and Owen had always been more complicated than they let people see. She stopped there, like she had already said enough. I did not push for details. At that point, it would not have changed anything I had already done. After that conversation, I had a clearer sense that I had not misread the situation. If anything, I had probably tolerated it longer than I should have. That made it easier to stay consistent with the decision. By the end of the first month, it felt settled. Not resolved in some emotional sense, just structurally finished. No contact, no overlap, no shared plans left to unwind. So when 4 months passed without hearing anything, I assumed that was permanent. Which is why when there was a knock on my door late on a Tuesday evening, I was not expecting it to be her standing there. It was around 8 in the evening, and I had just finished going through reports for the next day. I was not expecting anyone. I do not get unannounced visitors, and the timing alone made it unusual. When I opened the door, it was Julia. She looked different, but not in a vague way. Tired, visibly worn down, like the last few months had not gone the way she expected. Her posture was off, shoulders slightly forward, and she was holding her arms close to her body like she was trying to stay contained. Then I noticed her stomach. Not something you could miss once you registered it. She was pregnant, far enough along that it was obvious without guessing. That detail alone shifted the situation from unexpected to very specific, very quickly. She did not start with an apology. She started crying almost immediately, like she had been holding it together just long enough to get to my door. It was not subtle. Full emotional release, tears, uneven breathing, the kind of thing that usually pulls people into reacting first and thinking second. I did not step aside to let her in. I stayed where I was and asked her what she needed. Not cold, just direct. Given how things ended, I was not going to default to letting her back into my space without a clear reason. She tried to speak a couple of times before getting a full sentence out. When she did, it was fragmented. She said things had not worked out the way she thought. She said she made a mistake. She said she needed to talk to me. I asked her a more specific question. I asked if the child was Owen's. She hesitated. Not long, but long enough to answer the question without words. Then she nodded. That confirmed the timeline in a way I did not need to overanalyze. For months since I ended things, and she was already far enough along that it lined up with when we were still together. I did not react emotionally to that in the moment. It was just information being placed into a structure that already existed. The dinner, the pattern, her answer that night. It all connected cleanly. She started explaining without me asking. She said Owen had pulled away, that he was not ready for responsibility, that he had told her he needed space. She said she had nowhere stable to go long term, and that things had become overwhelming. Then she said she did not know who else to turn to. That part one registered carefully. Not that she wanted to fix things. Not that she realized something about our relationship. Just that she had run out of better options. I asked her one more question before deciding anything. I asked her why she was at my door specifically, given everything she had said to me the last time we spoke. She wiped her face, looked at me like I was supposed to already understand, and said I was the only stable person she knew. That answer clarified the situation more than anything else she had said so far. I stayed in the doorway the entire time. That was deliberate. Letting her inside would have changed the situation immediately, and I had no intention of creating any confusion about where things stood. I listened to what she said without interrupting, but I did not engage with it the way she seemed to expect. Once she finished explaining, I kept my response direct. I told her I understood that her situation had changed, but mine had not. I said she made her position clear 4 months ago, and I acted on it. That outcome was not temporary, and it was not open for revision now that things had not worked out on her end. She tried to push back, saying it was not that simple, that I was ignoring everything we had built. I let her talk, but I did not adjust anything in my stance. Then I made it clear. I told her she was not coming back inside, not for the night, not temporarily, not under any condition. I said it calmly, without raising my voice, but in a way that left no room for interpretation. That is when her tone shifted. The crying turned sharper, more frustrated. She said I was being cold, that anyone with basic decency would not turn someone away in her position. I did not argue with the framing. I just restated the boundary. I told her I was not responsible for fixing the consequences of decisions she made after dismissing mine. I said there were other options available to her, but I was not one of them. She stood there for a few seconds, like she was waiting for me to soften or reconsider. When that did not happen, she tried one last angle, bringing up the time we spent together, the fact that we were supposed to get married, like that should change the outcome now. It did not. I told her that same history included her telling me she would choose him every time. I said I believed her then, and I still did. That was the last thing I needed to say. There was a pause after that. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet moment where it was clear the conversation was finished. She wiped her face, adjusted her bag, and her expression changed from emotional to flat. Not calm, just closed off. She did not argue again. She turned around and walked away without saying anything else. I closed the door, locked it, and that was it. No follow-up, no message afterward, no attempt to reopen the conversation. The situation ended the same way it started, with a clear decision, followed by action. After she left, things went back to being quiet again, but not in the same way as before. The first time, it felt like a clean break. This time, it felt confirmed. I did not follow up with her, and she did not try to contact me again. No messages from unknown numbers, no emails, nothing through mutual contacts. Given how direct the conversation at the door had been, I was not expecting anything different. The next few days were uneventful. Work stayed the same, my routine stayed the same, and I did not make any adjustments beyond what I had already done months earlier. If anything, I was more certain that ending things when I did was the correct move, not just a reasonable one. About a week later, I ran into Tessa again, this time more intentionally. I had a question, and she was one of the few people who might actually give a straight answer without trying to protect Julia. We met for coffee, and I told her briefly that Julia had shown up at my place. I did not go into every detail, just enough to explain the situation. Tessa did not look surprised this time either, which was consistent with her reaction before. I asked her directly how long things between Julia and Owen had actually been blurred. Not rumors, not guesses, just what she had personally observed. Tessa took a second before answering, like she was deciding how much to say. Then she told me that from her perspective, it had been crossing lines well before I ever brought it up. Not necessarily in a way that was obvious to outsiders, but enough that people close to Julia had noticed. She mentioned weekends where Julia would say she was busy, but end up spending most of her time with Owen. Late-night calls that were not casual. Plans that were adjusted around him more often than anyone else. None of it was presented as one big event. It was a collection of smaller choices that added up over time. I asked if there was ever a point where it became clearly physical. Tessa said she did not have proof of that, but she also said it would not have surprised her given how things were trending. That answer lined up with everything I had already pieced together. The timeline, the behavior, the way Julia responded when I confronted her. It all pointed in the same direction. What stood out most was that none of this seemed sudden. It was not like something changed overnight after I left. It looked more like something that had been developing gradually while I was still there, and I just chose to address it when it became undeniable. After that conversation, there was nothing left to question. No loose ends, no missing context that would have changed the outcome. I went back to my routine, and this time it actually felt finished. Not just quiet, but closed. The only thing left was dealing with the fact that the version of the relationship I thought I had was not the one I was actually in. What settled in over the next couple of weeks was not anger. It was adjustment. The situation was already resolved from a practical standpoint, but there is still a process of recalibrating how you evaluate things after something like that. I went back over the timeline once, not repeatedly. Just enough to check if I had missed anything major or ignored something obvious. The answer was no. The signs were there. I addressed them directly. I got a clear response. Then I acted on it. There was no gap where a different decision would have led to a better outcome. If anything, the later confirmation made it clear that delaying would have made things worse. The overlap between her relationship with me and whatever was developing with Owen was already there. I just chose not to tolerate it once it became explicit. A couple of mutual acquaintances reached out indirectly during that time. Nothing confrontational, more like casual check-ins that were clearly meant to gather information. I kept my responses consistent and minimal. We ended things because of incompatible priorities. That was enough. I did hear, secondhand, that Julia had moved in with a friend temporarily after things with Owen fell apart. No long-term plan, just short-term arrangements. I did not follow up on that or try to verify details. It did not change anything on my end. The part that stood out most, looking back, was how predictable the outcome actually was once you remove the emotional framing. She prioritized him when things were easy. He stepped back when things required responsibility. That left her looking for stability somewhere else. I just happened to be the closest previous option. That is why her showing up at my door did not feel random after the fact. It followed a pattern. When one option failed, she moved to the next most stable one available. The difference was that I had already removed myself from that rotation. By that point, my routine felt normal again. Work, home, a few consistent habits. No interruptions, no unresolved conversations waiting to happen. It was not about moving on in some dramatic sense. It was just returning to a structure that made sense. The last thing I did, mainly for completeness, was clear out the box of small items she had left behind months earlier. I donated what could be donated and disposed of the rest. No reason to keep anything that would invite unnecessary contact later. After that, there was nothing left tying the situation to my day-to-day life. And that was the point where it stopped being a recent event and became something that had already been handled. At this point, there is not really an ongoing situation, which is why I am posting this more as a final check than a request for immediate advice. Everything that needed to be decided has already been decided, and everything that needed to be done has already been done. There is no contact between me and Julia, and there has not been since the night she showed up at my door. There is no overlap left in terms of housing, finances, or shared plans. Structurally, it is finished. What I have been thinking about more recently is not whether I made the right call, but how early the outcome was actually determined. Looking back, the key moment was not when she showed up pregnant. It was not even the dinner at Tessa's place. It was the conversation in my kitchen when I asked a direct question and got a direct answer. She told me clearly where I stood. There was no confusion in what she said, and there was no hesitation. If I forced a choice, she would choose him every time. That statement removed any ambiguity. Everything that happened after that just followed the logic of that answer. If I had ignored it, minimized it, or tried to negotiate around it, the end result would not have changed. It would have just been delayed and probably more complicated. Her coming back months later did not introduce new information. It confirmed the pattern. She prioritized him when it suited her, and when that option stopped working, she looked for stability somewhere else. I was not interested in being a fallback. The only part one have had to process is accepting that the version of the relationship I thought I was in did not match reality for a while before I addressed it. Not in a dramatic way, just in terms of recognizing that consistent small behaviors matter more than isolated reassurances. At this point, my life is back to being predictable. Work is steady, my routine is intact, and there is no ongoing situation connected to this. So I guess the reason I am posting is simple. I want to know if there is anything in how I handled this that I am not seeing. Not emotionally, but logically. From my perspective, I asked a clear question, got a clear answer, and acted in a way that was consistent with it. When she came back later under different circumstances, I stayed consistent with that same decision. If there is a flaw in that approach, I would rather see it now than repeat it later. Bye-bye.
My fiancé said at couples counseling, "He's too plain, I only stayed because being single at my age is depressing." She laughed as if it was a joke. I didn't say a word, just let her keep talking. When the therapist turned to me, I said, "I think this session just fixed everything for me." I'm Eric, 27, and I'd been engaged to Vanessa for 8 months when she suggested couples counseling. We'd been together for 4 years total, and honestly, I thought things were fine. Not perfect, but fine. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our plans for the future, but Vanessa kept saying she felt disconnected and that we needed professional help before the wedding. I agreed because that's what you do when your partner says they're struggling, right? You show up. You try. So I found a therapist, Dr. Patricia Hammond, a woman in her 50s with great reviews, and we scheduled our first session for a Thursday evening in early March. The session started normally enough. Dr. Hammond asked us basic questions. How long had we been together? What made us decide to get engaged? What were our main concerns? Vanessa went first. She talked about feeling like we'd fallen into a rut, that our relationship lacked excitement, that she worried we were more like roommates than romantic partners. Fair criticisms, I thought. We could work on that. Then Dr. Hammond asked her to be more specific. Can you give me an example of what you mean by rut? Vanessa shifted in her seat. Well, like, Eric's very predictable. He wakes up at the same time every day, goes to the gym, comes home, makes dinner. It's the same dinner rotation every week. He watches the same shows. He wears the same kinds of clothes. Everything is just safe. Boring, even. I felt my jaw tighten, but I stayed quiet. Dr. Hammond had told us at the start that this was a judgment-free space where we needed to be honest. And how does that make you feel? Dr. Hammond asked. Like I'm settling, Vanessa said. Then she laughed, this nervous little laugh that didn't match the weight of what she'd just said. I mean, he's a good guy. Stable, reliable, all that stuff your mom tells you to look for. But he's too plain. I only stayed because being single at my age is depressing. She kept laughing, like she'd made a joke. Like she expected me to laugh too, or for Dr. Hammond to chuckle knowingly about the trials of modern relationships. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, hands folded in my lap, letting her words sink in. Dr. Hammond's expression remained neutral. Vanessa, when you say you only stayed, can you clarify what you mean by that? Oh, you know. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. Like, I'm 32. Most of my friends are married or having kids. The dating pool gets worse every year. Eric's safe. He's not going anywhere. He'll be a good husband, probably a good dad. It's just not exciting, you know? I see, Dr. Hammond said slowly. She turned to me. Eric, how are you feeling about what Vanessa just shared? I looked at Vanessa. She was still smiling, like she genuinely didn't understand what she'd just done. Like calling me too plain and admitting she was only with me out of fear of being single was just standard couples therapy fare. I think this session just fixed everything for me, I said calmly. Vanessa's smile faltered. What do you mean? I mean, you just told me in front of a licensed therapist that you don't actually want to be with me. You're with me because you're scared of being alone. That's not a relationship. That's a hostage situation. Eric, come on. She reached for my hand. I pulled it away. I was just being honest. That's what we're supposed to do here. You were honest, I agreed. And I appreciate that, because now I know exactly what I need to do. Dr. Hammond interjected gently. Eric, I think there's value in exploring these feelings together. What Vanessa expressed, while painful to hear, might be a starting point for— No, I said, still calm. I'm not interested in convincing someone to want me. I'm not interested in being someone's backup plan, because the dating pool is depressing. I deserve better than that. Eric. Vanessa's voice had an edge now. You're overreacting. I didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it? She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I just meant that relationships take work, and sometimes you have to choose stability over passion. That's mature. That's settling, I corrected. You literally just said you're settling for me. The rest of the session was tense. Dr. Hammond tried to mediate, to get us to a place where we could communicate productively. But I was done communicating. I answered her questions politely but didn't engage with Vanessa's attempts to backtrack or reframe what she'd said. When the hour was up, I stood, thanked Dr. Hammond for her time, and walked out. Vanessa followed me to the parking lot. Eric, wait. Please, can we talk about this? What's there to talk about? I unlocked my car. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know, I was being too honest. I shouldn't have said it like that. The problem isn't how you said it, Vanessa. It's that you think it. You think I'm boring. You think you're settling. You're only with me because you're afraid of being single at 32. That's not— She stopped herself. Okay, maybe I do feel some of those things sometimes. But every couple has doubts. Every relationship has moments where you wonder if this is really it. That's not the same as being with someone because you're scared to be alone. So what, you're just going to throw away 4 years over one therapy session? You threw away 4 years the moment you admitted you don't actually want to be here. I got in my car. She stood there in the parking lot, arms crossed, watching me drive away. Update 1. I drove to my buddy Kevin's place. He opened the door, took one look at my face, and said, "What happened?" I told him everything. The therapy session, Vanessa's comments, the way she'd laughed like it was all just a funny observation instead of a devastating confession. Jesus, Kevin said when I finished. That's brutal, man. The worst part is I don't even think she realizes how bad it was. She kept acting like I was overreacting. What are you going to do? End it, I said simply. What else is there to do? I'm not going to marry someone who thinks I'm boring and is only with me out of fear. Do you need a place to stay? Nah, the apartment's mine. She moved in with me a year ago. I'll tell her to move out. I spent the night at Kevin's anyway, just to clear my head. Vanessa called me 11 times. I didn't answer. She texted me variations of, "Please call me and we need to talk about this," and "You're being unreasonable." I turned my phone off around midnight. The next morning, I went back to the apartment while Vanessa was at work. I packed all her stuff, clothes, toiletries, the decorative pillows she'd insisted we needed, all of it, into boxes and suitcases. Then I called her. "Eric, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all night." "I know. Listen, your stuff is packed. You can come get it today or I can drop it off at your sister's place. Your choice." "What?" "Eric. No, you're not serious." "I'm completely serious. Over one comment? One stupid comment I made in therapy?" "It wasn't one comment. It was the truth. You said it yourself. You're only with me because being single is depressing. That's not love, Vanessa. That's convenience." "I love you," she said, and she was crying now. "I do. I was just having a moment. Everyone has doubts sometimes. Having doubts is normal. Building a relationship on fear of being alone isn't. Come get your stuff." "Eric, please. Can we at least talk in person? Please?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. She showed up an hour later, eyes red from crying. We sat in the living room, me on the couch, her on the chair across from me. The boxes of her belongings were stacked by the door like a wall between us. "I'm sorry," she started. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean any of it. I was just nervous, and I said stupid things." "You weren't nervous. You were honest. Maybe too honest, but honest. People say things they don't mean all the time. Do you think I'm boring?" She hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. "But that's not a bad thing. Boring is stable. Boring is safe. Boring is not what you build a marriage on. We have a good life together, Eric. We're compatible. We want the same things. That matters more than excitement." "You're right," I said. "We are compatible. But you don't want me. You want the life I can give you. There's a difference. That's not fair. Isn't it? When's the last time you looked at me like you were excited to see me? When's the last time you initiated anything between us? A date, a conversation, anything?" She didn't answer. "You know what I realized last night?" I continued. "For the past year, maybe longer, I've been the only one actually trying. I plan our dates. I make dinner. I ask about your day. I try to make you laugh, and you just exist next to me. You tolerate me. That's not true. Name one thing you've planned for us in the last 6 months. One surprise, one date night, one gesture that showed you were thinking about me." She stared at her hands. "I can't do this anymore," I said. "I can't be with someone who sees me as a backup plan." "What about the wedding? The deposits? I'll eat the costs. Consider it payment for 4 years of my life." "Eric, take your stuff, Vanessa. Please." She left that afternoon, took everything in 2 trips and her sister's SUV, didn't say goodbye, just walked out with the last box and closed the door behind her. Update 2. The first week after she left was weird. The apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I kept expecting to hear her come through the door, to see her shoes by the entrance or her coffee mug in the sink. But it was just me. I called off the wedding. Most of the deposits were non-refundable, which hurt financially. But not as much as marrying someone who thought I was too plain would have hurt long-term. I sent a message to our friends and family explaining that we'd decided to go our separate ways, kept it vague, didn't air any dirty laundry. Vanessa apparently had no such discretion. Kevin told me she'd been posting on social media about toxic masculinity and men who can't handle honest communication. She'd told her friends I'd dumped her over one comment taken out of context. She was painting herself as the victim of an emotionally immature man who couldn't handle couples therapy. "Are you going to say something?" Kevin asked. "Set the record straight?" "No," I said. "Anyone who knows me knows that's not how it went down. Everyone else doesn't matter." But then her sister called me. "Eric, it's Melissa. Do you have a minute?" I'd always liked Melissa. She was practical, straightforward, the opposite of Vanessa in a lot of ways. "Sure. What's up?" "I need to apologize to you," she said. "Vanessa's been staying with me and she's been going on and on about how you overreacted and threw away your relationship over nothing. But I was there when she came home from therapy that night. I heard her on the phone with her friend Kayla." "Okay?" "She was laughing about it, Eric. She was telling Kayla how she'd finally been honest about you being boring and how you'd freaked out and how she'd give you a few days to calm down and then you'd come crawling back because you need her." My stomach turned. "She said that?" "Verbatim. And Kayla asked if she even wanted you to come back, and Vanessa said, 'Not really, but the wedding's already planned and I'm not starting over at my age.'" I sat down. Jesus. I told her she was being awful. We got into a huge fight about it. She called me a traitor and said I was taking your side over my own sister's. But Eric, you did the right thing. She doesn't love you. She loves what you represent: stability, marriage, checking boxes. That's not fair to you. Thank you for telling me, I said. Really? I'm sorry you got hurt. You're a good guy. You deserve someone who's excited to be with you, not someone who's just afraid to be alone. After I hung up, I felt this weird mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication because I now knew I'd made the right call. Sadness because 4 years of my life had been spent with someone who saw me as a checkbox on her life plan. Update 3. 2 weeks after the breakup, Vanessa showed up at my apartment. I'd just gotten back from the gym, ironic, given her complaints about my predictable routine, and there she was, sitting on the steps outside my building. We need to talk, she said. We've talked enough. Eric, please. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what I said. And I realize I hurt you. I was defensive and I said things I shouldn't have. But I think we can work through this. Dr. Hammond even said, "You're still seeing Dr. Hammond?" Well, yeah. For individual sessions. She thinks we should try couples therapy again, with both of us in a better headspace. No. Eric. Vanessa, your sister told me what you said, about how you were just waiting for me to come crawling back, about how you don't even want me but you're not starting over at your age. Her face went pale. Melissa told you that? She did. So no, I'm not interested in more therapy. I'm not interested in working through this. I'm interested in moving on with my life. She had no right to tell you that. She took it out of context. What context could possibly make that okay? She didn't have an answer. I was hurt, she said finally. I was venting to a friend. People say things they don't mean when they're hurt. You seem to say a lot of things you don't mean, I observed. How am I supposed to know which version of you is real? The version that loves you. The version that loves me wouldn't have said any of those things. Not in therapy, not to her friend, not ever. I walked past her to my building door. I made a mistake, she called after me. One mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. It wasn't one mistake, I said without turning around. It was a pattern of disrespect that I just finally noticed. And I'm not going back to it. I went inside and didn't look back. Final update. It's been 2 months now. Vanessa stopped trying to contact me about 3 weeks ago. Melissa told me she'd started dating someone new, a guy she met on a dating app, apparently very exciting and spontaneous. I genuinely hope it works out for her, though I doubt it will if she's looking for excitement to fill whatever void she's running from. I've been doing well. Better than well, actually. I started saying yes to things I'd been putting off, picked up guitar again, joined a hiking group, went on a weekend trip with Kevin and some friends. Turns out I'm not boring. I was just boring to someone who didn't appreciate me. Dr. Hammond actually reached out to me last week. She asked if I'd be interested in a few individual sessions to process everything that happened. I agreed. In our first session, she told me something I needed to hear. Eric, what happened in that couples session was unfortunate, but it was also necessary. Vanessa revealed something she might not have revealed otherwise. She gave you information you needed to make an informed decision about your future. That's valuable, even if it hurt. I keep wondering if I overreacted, I admitted. You didn't. You heard your partner say she doesn't value you, and you chose to value yourself instead. That's not overreacting. That's self-respect. I've been on a couple of dates. Nothing serious yet, but there's this woman, Amy, who works at the coffee shop I go to. She asked me out last week and we're getting dinner this Friday. She laughed at my jokes, asked about my hobbies, seemed genuinely interested in who I am. It was refreshing. Kevin asked me yesterday if I regretted how everything went down. No, I said. I regret not seeing it sooner, but I don't regret leaving. Think you'll ever talk to Vanessa again? Probably not. There's nothing left to say, and there isn't. She showed me who she was in that therapy session, and I believed her. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is listen when people tell you they don't want you, even if they're not saying it directly. I'm 27. I have time. I have self-respect, and I have the rest of my life ahead of me with someone who'll see me as an adventure, not a backup plan. Edit 1. People keep asking if I ever got an apology from Vanessa. No, not a real one. Just a lot of justifications and excuses. That told me everything I needed to know. Edit 2. For those asking about the wedding costs. I lost about $8,000 in deposits. Hurt at the time, but worth every penny to not marry the wrong person. Edit 3. Amy and I have been on 3 dates now. It's early, but she's kind and she makes me feel seen. I'm taking it slow and just enjoying getting to know someone who actually wants to be here.